Do you have an interest in the legacies that historical and not so historical figures leave behind? Are you curious about how to ensure family heirlooms and life lessons are passed on from generation to generation? Are you interested in developing your end-of-life plan to alleviate family discord and encourage generational wealth? Well, I invite you to listen to Heirloom and Legacy, a podcast that explores ancestry, heirlooms, legacy, mortality, and more. I am Angeline C. Fraser Giles, your host, and I look forward to sharing these discussions with you. In this conversation with my friend Cynthia Robbins, we focused on the nuances and challenges of her becoming the administrator of her parents' estates after their deaths. We had some technical difficulties, so please bear with the sound quality of this podcast. I promise the information Cynthia provides regarding estate administration is invaluable. Cynthia Robbins is an entrepreneurial consultant who has helped to build, lead, and support successful, enduring organizations since she was a student at Harvard and Stanford. She is skilled in program, resource, and organizational development, capacity building, and program design. Most recently, she co-launched Real Property Solutions Team, an enterprise dedicated to transforming housing problems into dream homes and finding ways to invest in community. Cynthia was previously the executive director of See Forever Foundation's Maya Angelou Schools in Washington, D.C., and teamed up with UDC School of Law co-founder Dr. Edgar Kahn to launch the Racial Justice Initiative of Time Banks USA. Together, they pioneered a strategy for civil rights enforcement and policy change to inspire young people and families affected by public systems. Cynthia is married and resides with her husband, Jackie, in Washington, D.C., where they are both active members of People's Congregational Church. I hope you are enlightened by our discussion.
Well, first of all, I want to say to you, Angeline, that I am so happy to be your guest this day, and I am really excited about this venture you've launched because it is really an important contribution to the community that you might help people to think and prepare for what is inevitable. As one of my friends said, none of us is getting out of this one alive.
That is for sure.
So we might as well prepare well for the end, for our own end and the end of our loved ones' lives. And I have to say that my mother, who died almost exactly 14 years after my father, was an extraordinary woman. My parents were extraordinary people, but my mother was an extraordinary organizer. And thankfully, she was very diligent to ensure that her affairs were largely in order and to rehearse with me the things that would need to be done at the point of her death. And I think if there's one gift that you can give to your loved ones, it is that, to prepare them, to organize as much as you can in advance, and then they will, in their grief, be able to know that they are doing what you have asked and what you would like them to do. So that's the first thing that I would say on being an administrator, an executor, or anyone who is a family member. It's really an important work for you to prepare.
I want to pick up a little bit on what you just said in terms of you having conversations and your mother preparing you. A lot of people don't want to talk about end of life planning because they think that if they do, it's going to happen tomorrow, or it might happen the second that they decide that they're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to a lot of people who say that, well, when I'm gone, I'm gone. They'll just have to fight about it or just deal with it. And so talk a little bit about, you talked about the importance, but about the fact that having things in place alleviates that discord To some
Absolutely.
degree. Sometimes there's still discord, even if there are the best laid plans in place. There's still the potential, depending on who's involved in the whole estate. There's potential for discord. So, talk a little bit about just the discussions that you had with her.
Both of my parents were extraordinary in their parenting, in their I've heard the term adulting, but in their relationship with us, and particularly with me as their youngest child, the only one of their offspring who became a lawyer. And I was single for most of the time until 5 years before my mom's death, and before my father's death, I was single. So I had a lot more free time to spend with them, and did. So I had a very close relationship with my parents. They lived until each of them passed in the garden apartment complex to which I was brought home from the hospital as an infant. And so there was a real home feel there. And I spent a lot of time there. I saw them every month, and many times, multiple times a month, once I moved back to the East Coast. And though I lived in Washington and they in New York, we spent many days per year in each other's homes, and lots of time together on the phone, and just in doing exciting, wonderful things together. Both of my parents were great about preparing. So they bought a mausoleum space at a nearby cemetery before they both died. I actually should have reviewed what date it was, but it was at least 5 years before my father died, and it may have been longer ago, or longer before than that. So that was the first thing they did, which again, it's something that can just relieve stress from the family. It was clear the thing was already engraved with their names and their
How
birth
they were
years.
prepared.
It just didn't have, of course, the date of their
That day.
demise.
Mhm.
Um, so my father, who died in 2005, was, we already kind of knew the drill, because he was buried, he was interred there. And so it was just a matter of time, right? So my mom had a file with the information about the cemetery and what needed to be done, the numbers to call, etc. She also had a card on which she had written the number to call for the pension plan, the number to call for the funeral home, the number to call for the florist she wanted us to use, the number to call for, all the other kinds of arrangements that needed to be made. In addition, you asked if there was an insurance policy, did I know where that was? I knew where everything was. I actually had gone, and at one point, I didn't know it as well as I should have known it, because I was sort of consulting with her, and she was like, "I'm not going to be here, so you better remember exactly where I put the key and the folder and the file and the
Right.
whatever, because you have to do this by yourself." And so I got better at the drill of like what to do, who to call, when to do what. And so when it actually came to the day, I knew, I knew what to do.
Mhm.
And so that was a huge help. My mother worked with my father to get his obituary done. He wrote it in his hand. And
Incredible.
similarly, she did the same. She hand wrote. She didn't use a computer, but I did. So I took the scraps that she had and put them together, and we went over it and edited it in September, the year before she had the stroke in February. The program for her funeral, we started with the obituary that she had approved. I updated it with the information in her final year. But again, what a blessing! What
What a
a
blessing.
tremendous blessing. Um, Similarly, she had gone through and found a lot of photographs, and while we did more searching, and I'm blessed that my husband is a professional photographer and was wonderful about gathering family photos and going through photo albums and all this stuff. But we we had a lot of resource that was gathered and organized. The other thing that she did, and my parents did, is they periodically purged and got rid of stuff.
So, Cynthia, you have made all the phone calls, you've called the florist, you have conferred with the funeral home, you have done all the things that your mother has laid out. Now you have to deal with the legalities of everything, right? The court, the probate of the will. And let's actually go back. If she, if your mom planned this much, I am presuming that she planned and had a will in place. So let's start with the will. You have the will, the original. Then what? Where do you go? What do you do?
Well, that's actually a great question, because as organized as my mother was, and as willing as she was to plan and talk and do things, I hadn't seen her will, and I had offered a couple of times to get local New York lawyers, which is where my parents lived, to review the will and make sure that everything was in order. And she assured me that it was. She was very organized, and she had written a will, but my mother had not had it properly witnessed. And although I offered to have the will reviewed by local attorneys, I was not actually, she didn't want to do that. And so uh, it was not until after she passed and that I understood that the document she had prepared was not going to stand up as an official will. It was a clear expression of her wishes. And so it could be good guidance, but it required that her estate be administered rather than executed by an executor.
So let's stop there. When you do not have a will or an official document that has been, and it depends on the jurisdiction, if you need to have 2 witnesses, 3 witnesses, and have it notarized. If there are certain things that are not in place in regard to a will in your jurisdiction, it essentially is not a valid will. So if you put together your will and you have it notarized and you have the witnesses and everything is in place, you name in your will an executor. If you do not have a legal valid will, the court then decides who the administrator of your estate is. So I just want everyone to be clear on those 2 things. So continue, Cynthia.
So so I went to the local court, and in the state it was called the surrogates court, but that's pretty easy to figure out what it's called and where it is for the jurisdiction where your loved one passes. And there they give you guidance as to what is to be done. And they're even in administration, typically they have the way to administer an estate which is of a certain value as compared to one that has a greater value, because they had property. Uh, and even though it was a co-op, so it wasn't considered real property, but it is property, that made their estate greater than a small estate process. So I'm not exactly sure what the small estate process of administration is. I'm sure
I
it's somewhat
think
simplified.
in New York, it may be 50,000.
Yeah, I think that's
Be
the
the
amount.
threshold.
Yes, that is the threshold.
Mhm.
But I'm not certain what the responsibilities are of an administrator. But
Okay.
but those in these offices, they have them fairly clearly laid out. And there also was a help office on the same floor with the office for administration and the office for probate and executors to go in. And that office, they had hours that they were available to assist. But they could answer some basic questions. They couldn't give you legal advice, but they could give you sort of, administrative advice and logistical advice and guidance. And I found that the staff people in the offices were also quite helpful. And so there were packets of forms to be filled out. I have two siblings, so there were documents they needed to sign in order that they were basically consenting to me being in the role of administrator. And they had to get them notarized, and we had to file those. There are other documents that have to be filed and notarized, and I believe in every court there is a notary in the court house, and they notarize for free. You also can get usually at local banks, especially if you have any accounts or your family members have accounts in particular banks. They will usually have a notary on hand who can notarize the various forms that you'll need to return to the court. And so it was good to kind of know what needed to be done, where and when, and to know how I could get things processed. There also was an office with information on file, and where you could get sort of historic information, because as I mentioned, my dad had passed 14 years earlier, and but we had never probated his. He didn't have a will, and he didn't have even sort of. He had just told us everything goes to your mom, which is fine by us. But as it turns out, since they both had their names on the shares for the co-op, I had to become the administrator of his estate as I was trying to sell the co-op where they both lived. And I didn't become the administrator of his estate until after I became the administrator of her estate. So this is as we were trying to sell the property. So that was an important, an
That's
important
an
thing to
important
learn.
detail to
Mhm.
know, that even though someone might say, yeah, everything goes to your mom or everything goes to your dad, if there was not a will in place when they died, then you have to, it's like you've got to go back and rewind and say, okay, in light of the fact, your father passed away before your mom, but the court needs you to prove, in fact, that that actually happened, that they weren't divorced, that he wasn't still living on a island somewhere, that he was in fact deceased. And so you have to prove that to move forward with the current situation, your mom's estate.
Yes, and well, proving that his passing was easily done because we had a copy of his death certificate, which again, with my mother's great organization, there was the copy of his death certificate with all the other paperwork I needed.
And if you
Um,
don't have that on hand, then you have to request that. And more than
exactly.
likely, they need a certified copy of the death certificate. So if the death certificate is not in the files of the person who just recently passed, meaning your mom, then you would have had to request that from Vital Records, or whatever
For the
entity it is,
jurisdiction.
the
That's it.
jurisdiction,
Hmm.
to get the certified copy of the death certificate. So you have that in hand. So you're a step, you moved a step back, but you're 2 steps ahead.
Exactly. And just the other note, at the time of the sort of the most recent death, in this case, my mom's, when we were making the funeral arrangements at the funeral home, they ask you, how many death certificates do you want? And during the first year after death, at least at that funeral home, and it's probably true at most others, you can request copies, and they are $15 a piece. So a de minimis sum a piece at the time. But after that time, because as it turned out, I needed another copy of my father's original certified copy of my father's death certificate. So I had to go to Vital Records, and it's a little bit more expensive.
Mhm.
So it's good to think ahead and get several copies of the death certificate at the time of death, because you will need those for different things. They have to be filed. They had to be filed at for insurance recovery. We have to file it with these official court papers for the administration of the estate. You have to file it with the sale of property, at the closing. So there are different places where you're going to require
Yes,
official.
and they don't want just a copy of it. They want
Correct. In many cases, a
a
copy will not
certified
do.
copy.
You need an original certified
Right.
certificate. It's sort of a waiting game, and I can tell you that post COVID, it's a different experience than it was before because, as you may recall, I was saying that I had begun the administration of my mom's estate, and actually was only as we were trying to sell the shares of the co-op that I realized I had to also handle my father's estate. So I started that somewhat later after COVID. And I would just forewarn everyone, and I think unfortunately it's going to be some time before all of these systems get normalized again. But things take longer. Many offices are still not operating at full tilt, and so they may not be in office. They may be operating remotely, and everything is taking longer, in part because they're just having to do so much more of it. There's so many more people passing away.
Right.
And so you have to wait a certain amount of time, and how long that time is depends, I guess, on everything from where, how many people have died in your jurisdiction to a number of other factors.
Yeah. So I'm dealing with a situation right now, and when you talk about going back, taking those two steps, one step back, two steps forward, or vice versa, I am in the process of becoming the administrator of my father's estate. My father passed away in 1988.
Mm.
At the time when he passed, he had property, but unfortunately, his wife, who my stepmother, who he married, his name was not on the property. So she has subsequently died of COVID. And now it's going all the way back to that point to become the administrator of my father's estate. And now that we have brothers and siblings, and we have nephews and now stepbrothers, there are about 6, 8 people involved in the process of this estate. So I am the test study, right? The case study. Please have your things in order because it's an expensive proposition. Just from what you're saying, getting a death certificate.
Hmm.
That's if you have to get 4, 5, 6 death certificates at $15 or $20 a piece, that's an expensive proposition, particularly for someone who may not have, the funds to do so.
But if you have to do it for somebody who passed, 20,
Years
30
ago.
years ago,
Yes.
and so you didn't get in that first year $15 a
Right.
certificate rate, then it's like 20 something dollars per
Yes.
certificate, or $25,
And
and
then if you need it
it all
immediately,
adds up.
you need it immediately, you need it sent, express, that adds up. So we digress a bit, but it's just to say to get things in order, to really think through what you have to do as the administrator or the executor of an estate, because even an executor is going to have to get a series of death certificates.
Exactly.
So you are now in the process where you have filed all the paperwork. It's taken time. You are officially the administrator of the
Of
estate.
Officially the administrator of my mom's estate, and then realizing that I have to become the administrator of my dad's estate while we're trying to sell the co-op during
COVID.
COVID. And so it was a press to really get things done. And I will also say, I am trained as a lawyer, but I have no expertise in estates, wills and estates and trusts. That's not, I never took a course. I just took enough of a study of it to pass the bar. And that was years ago. So it's not, and I'm never in the state where I was trying to get this done. So I really, I caution people that you may well need to get counsel. I didn't have counsel. I didn't have official attorney hired. However, I was resourceful. And again, before my mom passed, we recognized that we were going to have to do some special maneuvering since my dad's name was on the shares of the co-op. And since we didn't do it before he passed, it was as simple to do it after she passed. But I knew there was going to be this issue. So I decided, and I knew that I would need a real estate attorney in the jurisdiction. So I went to the real estate attorney who was co-located with the attorneys for the co-op. I figured he would have a little bit better insight into how to maneuver with the co-op attorneys.
Smart
And
move.
when we were selling the property, um, that he would be a resource, which he proved very much to be. And he gave me some guidance as to what I needed to do, and kind of some of the ins and outs of dealing with this with the court, for the administration. So I definitely say that if you can have counsel, it's better, especially if you're not a lawyer. But even as a lawyer, I'll tell you, this stuff was confusing. It took a lot of time. You got to get things certified and photocopied, and things have to be original. And it just seemed like everything took a lot of time. So, and I was blessed that I had control over my schedule. But for somebody who's trying to do this on a lunch break, or between picking their kids up from childcare and getting to their second job or whatever, it can be very taxing, and all of this can add to the stress. So during the as we're waiting for the sale to go through, and thankfully we found buyers who were able, but they have to go before the co-op board. There's just a process for each
Right.
of these steps. I found out that there were forms that I had to get filed from the state to say that the property could be sold. So I had to go to the state office of tax. Not when I say go, I mean, communicate with them.
Mhm.
Again, certified copies of this, that, and the other, that have to be mailed to wherever. And then you have to wait. So there's a lot of waiting, and there's a lot of steps, and you need to be very clear about what the steps are in order to be able to proceed with the uh, dispensation and whatever your tasks are. If you're selling property, if you're clearing out a house or an apartment, I mean, there's just so many steps. And if I may, just to add a little more nuance to that, there are in Washington D.C., where I live. There also are a lot of co-ops, not as many as New York. I think New York City has a lot of them, and I don't know around the state as well. But co-ops and condos, the big difference as well is that for a co-op, you own shares. You don't actually own the property, and a condo, you own the property. But in both cases, there usually is a board that has a role in making approval. For the co-op board, though, they have the flexibility to reject a prospective owner and not tell you why. So it is the one nuanced place where they can continue to I mean, there can be discriminatory reasons,
Right.
there can be financial reasons. You don't know what the reasons are sometimes. So there's no guarantee that a buyer that you identify is actually going to become acceptable, and you may not know why they are not. So
That's
I don't know
pretty
other
incredible.
jurisdictions if that's true, but that's a very scary situation for somebody who's responsible for getting rid of, disposing of the property,
Mhm.
that you may not even be able to, without several tries.
Incredible. Incredible. So it could be another way to discriminate.
Mhm.
Definitely
Yes.
against people. So you are the administrator, you have sold the property. Yay. The property is sold. The buyers were approved by the board, and you did what next? Because
Well,
I'm
actually,
sure
before
at
it's
this point,
sold,
go
before
ahead.
it's sold, because you're going to go to a closing, where everything's going to change hands. One of the things you have to have done by then, if you hadn't done it before, and it really for any kind of any situation where there's going to be property, you're going to have to get an EIN number for the estate, which when you good old Google, you just put in their EIN number for estates, and and all of these things come up. And I will caution people that the first things that come up look like they're official, and they even look like they're from the IRS. They're the same colors, similar emblems, but they may well not be. The first
And you'll
things that
find
come
that
up.
with a lot of forms. It's not necessarily the federal government form that comes up, the official form that comes up if you do a Google search, right? Or any type
Exactly.
of Bing search or whatever. There will be all of these other folks who have made sure that they come at the top of the list, and then you click the first one because you're trying to just get the information. So it's really, really a cautionary tale to make sure that you are accessing the proper form
from the official
from
source.
the official source, the official government, because all of this is government related, right? So governmental source that you're making sure that you're
your
getting
state,
proper
your jurisdiction, and the federal
Yes.
government. So it's the federal EIN is employer identification number, and the estate has to get that number in order to be able to open a bank account in the name of the estate. And that EIN number. Okay, so I went in knowing that there are ads up front, looking for the form. And so I started putting in the information, my and I had to have a separate account for each estate, the estate of my mother and the estate of my father. So I went in first for one. I can't remember which one. I think I did my I don't remember. So anyway, I went in for the name to become the administrator and set up the EIN for the first account. And I got all the way through the process, having given social security numbers and private information. And then it said, put in your credit card number to pay. I don't even remember what it was, but it was like maybe it was $110. I mean, it's not a ridiculously high sum, but it was, I thought this thing was free. So I looked at it again, and then I realized this was not the IRS form. It looked like the IRS form, and it was asking all the information I would need for the IRS form, but it was actually some intermediary, some middle person who was trying to make a buck or make $110 or whatever the price was. I don't remember.
And they do that. They will do it because people don't know that an EIN is free. You get it from the government.
Yeah, so I stopped at that point, and I was livid because I had already put in this private information. And once you put something in on the internet, who knows where that goes? But so I caution you to really be clear that it is the IRS form that you're filling out, because it is free to get an EIN number. It is fast, it is free, it is easy. You put that same information in, and if you have a printer or access to a way to save the document once you've filled it in. Obviously, if you're on a public computer or something like that, you're going to have to arrange to get copies sent to you or something like that. But otherwise, you can save the information from and have your EIN number the day that you try and set it up. Now, here I was, the administrator of two estates. I could not set up both numbers the same day, as I recall, as one person who is not like an official agent. But I didn't need to. So that was fine, because I realized I needed these numbers well in advance of the closing date. But you need to have them by the time of the closing, because at the time of closing, they're going to be either giving you a check or wiring the money, and you're going to have some place to put it. So
let's talk a little bit about that. So the reason you need the EIN is because you have to open a bank account.
Correct.
The EIN relates to the estate. So it's not your personal EIN, it's relative to the estate of the person. And you need to have a bank account opened because, as you just said, you're going to get a check or there's going to be a wire transfer to an account. And it cannot go into your personal account because there are other entities that are privy to the estate. So in your case, it's your siblings, and there may be creditors. So all of those things need to remain to be separate. Your account, your personal finances need to be separate from the estate in which you are the executor of or the administrator of. Those things need to be separated. So that is the purpose of applying for an EIN and having a separate bank account. And I know that there are a lot of people that don't realize that just don't have any idea that you need to have a separate bank account for an estate that you are the administrator of. So I just want to make sure that people are clear on that.
Yeah, no, that is a very important point. And you need to have it as you are getting resources in and or paying resources out. So depending on your situation, you may need to open the bank account immediately, or you may need to wait. But as soon as you're beginning to get income in, it's much cleaner to have the income go to establish the account and have the income go there.
Yes.
The other thing is, of course, tax requirements and just the obligation to file returns, etc. Again, in her inimitable organization. When I was visiting with my mom in late January, the year that she had the stroke, we had completed preparing her taxes in January. So when she had the stroke in February, and she was able to speak and to do things, but she was not in a position to do the kind of detailed work we had done before. And so, but because I had helped her with her taxes that year, I was able to also file the tax return even before I had been appointed as administrator, her final tax return for the year in which she died. So again, this is just the kind of thing that you really want to try and have organized, because it can be very challenging if you don't know where the people's financial information is, how much it is, where what they, where they keep their last year's tax return.
Right.
All of this is very important to have handy. So you have to file a final year return, and then you're going to have to file a tax return for the estate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's yet ahead of me, but that is an important undertaking, and for
And yet
every
the other
year.
reason you need the EIN
Exactly.
to file those taxes for the estate.
Mhm. And to keep track of things first, to get things and give things, and then to keep track of them, and then to tell the IRS and the state jurisdiction what you've done.
So all of this that you have gone through, it does lead people, or would lead people, to think that they need to obtain a lawyer because of the fact that there are all these moving pieces. And as you said, you had the wherewithal and the time to do some of this. A lot of people don't. They're handling their own, business. They're not able to go back and forth between, states to handle an estate and then go back and deal with their life that might be in another state, maybe across the country, maybe in a different country. And so it is important for you to recognize that maybe you need to hire an attorney. Some estates are small and you may not need to have one, but in situations where there is property involved and there's accounts, various banking accounts and pension plans and life insurance and all of these other potential financial vehicles, you want to make sure that you have someone who understands the process. So now
So
that you have, go
you
ahead.
need an attorney and you need accounting support, right? So
Yes.
you will need to have, and ideally, you will know who has been preparing the tax returns for your loved one, because obviously that is the ideal person to have prepare their return after their final return. That would be ideal.
Right.
However, in our case, and this happens, the accountant who prepared the return the year before my mom passed, um, for which she had organized everything, and he had been preparing her taxes for years. During that year, he was in a very serious car accident and left his practice.
Wow.
So he wasn't available to file and prepare the final return. But for the fact that I had prepared with him the year before, I could have been in a very difficult position. Even working with a new accountant, which I did have to do, but because I knew everything from the year before, it was easier to get a new accountant who could prepare the final tax return. So it is really important to be organized and to be mindful of all of the different steps that you have to follow. So I mean, I guess if there were three key points, I'd say, one, you want to do your research. You want to understand. No. Mm-mm. Number one is prepare. Prepare in advance. Know if you are going to appoint an administrator or be an administrator. Know this as far in advance of when you're going to have to do those duties as you can. And so if you're going to appoint one, really be mindful of who it is and get them as prepared as you can in advance. The other thing is I had access to my mother's accounts. So that again gave me much more flexibility than somebody who doesn't even know what bank they're in, which
So
could
when you
be.
say you had access, were you actually
I was on the
officially on the
accounts.
accounts?
Mhm.
Okay. Another important thing, if in fact you are not on the account, technically you're not supposed to access any funds that are in the decedent's bank account. If you are a joint owner of the account, that is different. So you just want to make sure that, and some people don't trust other people to be on their account, and that's understandable. Some people might have children that will go into their account, take all their money, and then there they are, trying to eat just peanut butter, because they don't have any money because someone's taken all the money out of the account. But if you are a joint owner of the account is treated differently than if you were just the daughter or the son of someone who had an account and your name is not listed on it, other than maybe being the beneficiary of the account. So I
Yeah,
just
so
wanted to clarify that.
that's a huge thing, and I probably would have had to establish the accounts and have an EIN number much before when I did, if had not I been the co-owner, the joint signatory on the accounts from which we were paying the monthly maintenance on the co-op and other bills in order to just keep things going.
Mhm.
So, so again, it is very important that as the administrator to be, or as the person seeking an administrator, that you do these advanced preparations. So that's number one, prepare. Number two is to just kind of identify support resources for yourself. Like I had the real estate lawyer who also did estate wills and estates. I had somebody in this jurisdiction who could guide me on some of the day in and day out and just sort of logistical issues. And then the third thing is to really read between the lines, and as much as careful as I thought I was being, there were many mistakes along the way and things that I sent the form to the state, the form that I needed to get back in order to be able to sell the co-op. I can't remember whether I didn't attach something or, oh no, they had a different form, and the only difference on the form was at the top of it, it said for people who died before, I think it was 2011, and for people who died after. So I used the same form to file for this document I needed from the state for my mother and my father. But remember, I said my father had died 14 years earlier.
Mhm.
So after waiting for 6 weeks for that form to the certificate I was requesting to be returned, I got a letter that said, "You this has been rejected because you used the wrong form."
Mhm.
So then I went back in and I took down the correct form that said for people who died before 2011. And let me tell you, the only difference about the form was that it had on the top of it for people who died before 2011. There was
Yes.
literally not one line different on the form.
I,
But they could not use that form
right.
that I filed on the one that said for people who died after 2011. So I had to wait another month for them to send me the certificate I was waiting for.
And you learn that the hard way sometimes. Yes, they want everything to be it's very particular. If you make a mistake, they will send it back to you. And
And
they
you start
waste
all over
time
again.
and you start over again. So lesson learned. Lesson
Yes.
learned.
So there were those kinds of events along the way just to spice up the journey. So I would say, read carefully and
Mhm.
then reread to make sure that you haven't left out something important. Oh, the other thing I will note is my father died, as I said, all this time before. So when I put in for his estate they ask you to represent your kind of what's the value of the estate, or what's in the estate, or something like that, or who are the heirs. So I put my siblings and me, because we're the heirs.
Mm-hmm.
But that also came back because my
Your mother.
mother's estate was
Mhm.
a joint heir.
Right.
And because she was his wife, she actually got half of his estate.
Mhm.
And then the siblings, my siblings and I, had to split the other half. So there's all this stuff. So that was another document that I had to revise, so that I could properly note her estate as a recipient of her share that then got divided up. Even though this is the property that we're talking about is the same co-op where they both lived,
Right.
that was going to be split up among their heirs, which were my siblings and me.
Mhm.
So even though it was a technicality, but it was a technicality that had to be resolved before we were done with
Yeah, yeah,
with the
definitely.
administration
Because
process.
if you look at the fact that uh, in my situation where my stepmom would have received 50% of my father's estate as the widow, and she's no longer here, then it goes to her heirs. And she had children out that were not my father's children, and my father had his children, and then
Mm.
subsequently grandchildren, right? So you have to, and that's why they were so specific that your mom had heirs, and those heirs had a certain level of authority in terms of reaping any benefits from her estate, but it came from your father leaving the full estate to her, and all of those things had to be designated in a way that the court understood, okay, this is this person's heir, and subsequently these now children, siblings, are the heir of your mom. So
Yeah, yes,
yes.
but to be very clear, and obviously for exactly the situation that you mentioned, Angeline, where there are different heirs of the people involved in the marriage, for in this case, um, this is even more a little more interesting here, because my father and my mother had the same heirs, except that my mother was also one of my father's heirs.
Right.
And so the estate had to be treated differently, even though ultimately, the three, their children were the ones that were going to be the
The
beneficiaries.
beneficiaries, yes.
So
Yes.
it is a complicated thing, but you have to make sure that you have properly recorded all of the heirs of the estate correctly, even if some of them are estates.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. So you are now in the final stages of your administratorship.
Yeah, and actually, I guess the final stages won't be. One other note I would say, and this was um, before I could be appointed administrator, as someone who lived in a different jurisdiction from the jurisdiction in which my parents passed, and where this I was appointed administrator, I had to also get a bond,
Yes.
and I had to, and then they're looking at you. How reliable are you? um, as it turns out, I have proven trustworthy in that I never accessed my the accounts on which I was a joint signatory. I never accessed them without the request of my mom. And but everybody, and I thankfully had my own resources, so I didn't need to access her accounts to do what I needed to get done. But as you were saying, Angeline, some people are not that blessed to have that kind of trustworthiness or resource access. But but I still had to get a bond. And then they're looking at you.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking at you as the prospective administrator. How reliable are you? What's your financial situation? Are you likely to take the money and run, basically?
Right.
That's why you have to have a bond. It's insurance. It's insurance that says that in your duties to disperse the estate, you will be trustworthy and you will do what you said you were going to do to the court rather than something other.
Mhm.
And that's another
It's another layer.
challenge.
Yes.
It's another layer, and you have to find a bonds person who can do what you need to get done, when you need to get it done, how you need to get it done. And you may have to go to their office and give them payment in the way that they want it. They don't, a lot of times they won't take credit cards, or there's extra fees if you get a credit card, rather than if you pay from an account. So these are all expenses. We didn't talk about the expenses, but
Right.
yes, you have to file at the court. There's a fee for that. If you want copies of the letters of administration, there are fees for that. If you want certified copies. Oh, and the one other thing I forgot to tell you is that for many transactions, especially real estate ones, and before the closing, they said, oh, by the way, the letter of administration you got for your mother's estate was more than 6 months ago. So you have to get a refreshed letter. I'm like, what do you mean refreshed
Right.
letter? This thing said it was going to be valid, but it was without limitation. They said, yeah, they don't want one that's more than 6 months old. So I had to go back, and this is now, we have a closing date, we have an approved buyer, we have everything. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what if I don't get the refreshed letter in time for the closing? It couldn't have gone forward.
Right.
So there's all this stuff that can make you feel very, very tense. But thankfully, those burdens are behind me and have worked out. But I mean, that's something I don't even know how you would know that.
And
I
most
don't know how
people
you would
won't.
know that.
You wouldn't necessarily know. You would not know. It's particularly the bond issue. That is huge. Like, what do you do? Do you go to a bondsman that you would go if you had to, get someone
I
out of
did
prison?
research
I mean, what do
online,
you do?
and
How do you get a
again,
bondsman?
when you do the research, you can come up with all sorts of entities. And I can't remember, there was a challenge because I was calling people and whatever, and I'm trying to get all this done because I was getting ready to leave town, and I had to take the official bond document to the court in order to finish getting appointed as administrator. That was a prerequisite of getting the letter of administration. So without the bond, I couldn't do it. And
Mm-hmm.
it had to be the original.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to really work around that. But thankfully, I was able to find a bond person who could do it on short notice before I was leaving town, and I was able to go pick up the bond, take it to the court, and that turned out to be the last day I was in town that the court was open before COVID.
Wow. Wow.
That was days before everything went on
Everything
lockdown.
shut down. Yeah. So yes, you were blessed to have
Many ways.
at least some things in place, and you knew enough to know what your mother's wishes were, and you were able to work through the process of then becoming the administrator of your father's estate. And they're all of these, what would appear to most people to be roadblocks to get to the final destination, right? Even with the best laid plans to get to that final destination. So the importance of having a plan, of talking to people about your family, about your end of life wishes, having an administrator or executor, if again, if it's a will that you're doing and you're naming the person is the executor as opposed to an administrator that is appointed by the court. You want to make sure that you have these things in order. Why leave a mess for your family to try to sort through? And even in having the best laid plans, there are still a variety of different issues that you have to handle. And there's a variety of different agencies that you have to go through. And why have your family members dealing with the grief of your loss, as well as all of the other financial and administrative issues and concerns related to your estate at the same time. So, Cynthia, is there anything else you want to leave us with today?
Yeah, no, just make it as easy for your family as possible. And just, I mean, the steps, write your obituary, even if it's just an outline. Put the information. The more you do, the better it will be. That's just the way it is in advance. The more you do in advance, the better it will be. And the idea always in this, I would say, as a lawyer, even if this is not my expertise, write it and make it plain when you can. And I would share that with as many people who need to know or who will be affected by what you write in advance as possible. Because then you can make it, it's best to have everybody in agreement when the writing is done so that there won't be any disagreements after the fact. So I think that you seek counsel and get your lawyer in place, get your accountant in place, figure out who these people are who can handle your affairs the way you wish them to be handled. It just will make life easier for everyone.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, I thank you so much for giving all of us this information. There's so many other things we probably could have talked about that, we may remember later on, oh, and that, and this, and that. But I think you have given us a lot to think about and to plan for. And I want to thank you again for being my guest today. And I truly do appreciate you taking the time and sharing this information, because I think it's vitally important people know. So thank you and take care.
You're most welcome. And thank you for the work that you're doing, because it's a blessing to the community. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.